Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his fountain name, salvation has been brought down, oh glory, praise the Lord.
Welcome to the Harvester Podcast. We're in Season 2, and we're going to do Episode 9. And we've been talking here, let me just introduce myself. I am Brian, and with me are...
Stephen Ford.
Forrest Samus.
And we're here to bring the podcast. And this season, we are talking about cultural issues, things that are facing our culture. And we've talked about some good things so far. And for this episode, we want to discuss abortion. And when we think about abortion, I always like to point out that all abortions are not the same. The actual medical definition, I guess, quasi-medical definition I'll add, is the expelling of the fetus from the uterus. That's an abortion. There are spontaneous abortions, which are sometimes called miscarriages. We see some of those in the Bible as well. But the ones we're talking about here today are induced abortions for the purpose of terminating a pregnancy. And so when we think about it, the issue is real in our day and age. Since Roe v. Wade in 1973, several abortions have taken place. Millions and millions of babies have been aborted. So how far spread do you think the issue still is today?
It's quite an issue. It's one of the more upfront, hot-button issues of the day. I mean, you find it on the political stage. Just about every recent election cycle is part of the, arguments that they make. So you can tell if it's at the forefront of political argumentation every, election cycle, then it's on the minds of the people. Yeah, and I've,
it's about probably 4 or 5 years ago at South Florida Avenue, I'm in charge of the messages on the marquee, and we've had a lot about homosexuality, a lot about this, a lot about that, but I don't think we've had a whole lot about abortion. And so one Sunday morning, we had some protesters around our sign down there by the driveway during a Sunday morning. And we came out, and they were saying that we didn't speak out against it enough, and that's why they were protesting us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that was pretty interesting. But anyway.
You're making both sides mad.
Oh, yeah.
I think from the statistics I've seen from the CDC and the Guttmacher Institute, abortion is less popular than it was in the 90s. But I think it's a fiery issue where even if a woman doesn't get an abortion, I know many people just in my own life who will still fight tooth and nail to defend a woman's right to get an abortion, right? Like, so even if they haven't gotten one, won't get one, it's still one of those issues where it transcends whether or not you personally are going to get one. It's one of those things where, like, do you believe a woman can, right? And if you don't believe a woman can, you're on the wrong side. And the person arguing with you might not ever get an abortion, but they feel like it's a right that a woman has in a modern society to be able to get an abortion. And if you disagree, you're regressive and you're wrong and backwards and all this different kind of stuff.
And I even know members of the church that would argue that I'm not going to have an abortion, but it's okay for a woman to have one. And then most of these, I'm afraid, just side with one political party who's really for that. And they can't see past that. And I've actually been befriended by good friends that weren't just Facebook friends, simply because I questioned why they were sharing all this stuff that was, one political party's view of, and this was in 2008.
Right.
But anyway, so when we discuss abortion, we just want to point out, and many of our listeners already know this, but just to refresh our memories, that, God does not distinguish between the personhood or the humanness of the life inside the womb versus the life outside the womb. And of course, human life is the key. If the baby inside, or if the fetus, to use their language, if it is human, then of course it's wrong to kill it.
Right.
And to be human involves body, flesh, or flesh, soul, and spirit. 1 Thessalonians 5:23. But there are some passages, for example, in Psalm 139, verse 13, and I won't read all these, but 139, 13 through 16, this is where David says, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And notice it was David who was in the womb, not just not just a blob of cells, Ecclesiastes 11:5, as thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so you do not know the works of God who makes all. And so here it's the child that's in the womb, not just some mass of cells. Job 3:11 through 16, again, this is where Job is cursing the day of his birth, wishing that day was never on the calendar, that he had not been born. And verse 16 talks about a hidden, untimely birth, which would be a miscarriage. Kyle and DeLeach, in their commentary, they refer to those in verse 16, and they even have the word in the commentary as abortions and the stillborn in their commentary on that. But the point is, the person inside the womb, again, is a person. It's a human individual. And then Jeremiah 1:5, of course, before I formed you, says God to Jeremiah, before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. Before you came out of the womb, I sanctified you. I ordained you to be a prophet to the nations. And so again, it's it's Jeremiah that was in the womb. And so, but especially in Luke chapter 1, this is a good New Testament passage, and we'll take a look at Luke chapter 1, verse 41. And the text says, it happened when Elizabeth, that is the mother of John the Baptist, heard the greeting of Mary, the mother of Jesus, that the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. But the babe, and that word babe is from the Greek word brephos, and it's in the womb. The babe in the womb leaped. And then if you look in verse 44, for indeed as soon as the voice of your greeting sounded in my ears, the babe, brephos, leaped in my womb for joy. And so while it's in the womb, it's called a brephos, or babe, as it's translated here. And then when you go to chapter 2 of Luke, in verse 12, and this will be the sign to you, and this is after Jesus was born, and here he's talking, in the context here, he's talking to the shepherds, actually, is it the wise men? The shepherds. But anyway, he says in verse 12, and this will be a sign to you, you will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. And there the word babe is that same brephos, and it's referring to Jesus outside the womb. Then also in verse 16 of Luke chapter 2, and they came with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And so again, brephos, whether the child is in the womb or whether it's outside of the womb, that same word is used. And so what does that imply about the humanness of a baby in the womb?
It's as much a human sitting there in swaddling cloths as it is in the womb.
Yes.
You know, and I think that when you even like from like a scientific perspective, but the Bible backs this up, as you know, true science is confirmed by God's word. You know, when you look at a baby in the womb, you see that it's not part of the woman's body, though it's connected to the woman's body. It's genetically different, right? Mm-hmm. If you take as soon as conception happens, there's a different genetic makeup from between the fetus and the woman, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not part of her body. You know that it's human because it's human DNA, it's human genetics, right? Once again, and you know that it's alive, mm-hmm. right? With it only takes a handful of weeks, and it's already got a heartbeat before too long, brain activity, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have to terminate the pregnancy, right? If it wasn't alive. So you know it's alive. You know it's a human being. You know it's separate from the mom. And I think with those three things in place, and then the Bible showing us, confirming us, hey, person's a person in the womb, outside of the womb, I think you have a really hard case to make to say it's moral to end that life. We know that it's alive. We know it's not just a part of the mom's body. We know that it's, that it is a human. And I think the game that people try to play is, yeah, it's human, but it's not a person. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you start to draw the line for which humans aren't persons, you're in really, really, really difficult territory. And pretty much every moral atrocity that's ever occurred, that's how it occurs. Yeah. People say, they'll say, whether it's Nazi Germany days, Jews, yeah, they're humans, but they're not persons. Mm-hmm. Or whether it's chattel slavery days, these Africans, they're human beings, but they're not persons. Whatever it is, where you say, hey, this person is, we admit it's a human, but it's not human like we are. You know what I mean? Like, it's on a lower level. Mm-hmm. And then now whatever crimes we commit against them are justified because we've kind of knocked them down. I think we see that happen to the unborn, where because they can't contribute to society, because they're not walking on their own, breathing on their own, because they're not fully developed, you're going to say, well, they're not worthy of the same protection and care and rights that every other human being has. And whatever line you draw is just arbitrary, right? If a fetus is not a human, whenever you say it becomes a human, or if a fetus isn't a person, wherever you say it becomes a person, is arbitrary, and I think you can't consistently hold that. I know I kind of went off in left field there, but all those things come to my mind when we start talking about the Bible's so clear in the womb, and it's confirmed by science, in the womb, a person is a person is a person.
Yeah. And there is in logic that law of excluded middle, so it's either a person or it's not a person. It's either human or it's not human. There is no in between.
Right.
And if you just let nature take its course, you know it's a human.
For sure.
But even with the insights we have into the womb now scientifically and the technology, we can see that it's a human. I mean, so far as the fingers and all that. And the argument, that's just part of the woman's body, as Forrest said, just doesn't hold true because, a finger has the same DNA as the mama. A hangnail, I suppose, would too. But that child in there has got a whole different DNA.
Distinct
DNA from the father and the mother together.
Right.
All right, so it's human, no doubt about it. The life inside the womb is human. Now, there's been, over the years, attempts to try to justify abortion. We'll just mention these briefly, but one attempt would be what's called the socioeconomic argument. That is, if in the opinion of the mother, a birth would work economic hardship or difficulties in the family or individual social pattern, then aborting the baby is acceptable. And, of course, I would say what pregnancy does not inconvenience economy or whatever. But anyway, that's one argument. Another argument is what's called the eugenic argument, and U is good, genic, sound, offspring argument. The basic argument states abortion is justified when there is the likelihood that the baby might be mentally or physically defective. And I hear in pregnancies nowadays, in fact, I don't know, Forrest his wife just had a baby not too long ago. And did they offer you a genetic screening ahead of time? Yes. Okay.
And it's not covered by insurance.
No.
The first time we did it, just because you can see if it's your girl or boy ahead of time, but it was like $1,000 or something like that, but they also tested for all these other things, Down syndrome, certain genetic, et cetera, but I've heard stories of people where I know people personally where doctors told them, hey, your baby's going to have this, that, the other, you should go ahead and have an abortion. And then they said, no, we're not doing that. And then the baby's born perfectly healthy and without any kind of, I don't know how often that is, but I know two people personally who were told by their doctor, hey, your baby's going to have this syndrome, this disorder, et cetera. Go ahead and get an abortion.
Wow.
And they stuck to their guns and were like, no, absolutely not. And then the baby there was no, disorder or syndrome. So even that I think is kind of, you don't.
That's scary.
It is very scary. Do the screening, but how many of those babies were aborted because the doctor said, hey, it's going to have this or that, and didn't. Not that it's justifiable to begin with, but still.
Right, still.
Both of those first two arguments, they open up a door, as Forrest was kind of leading the conversation. It seems, at least my thinking was going there, that the argument could be made that if a person, weighs on you socially or economically, if a person has mental, emotional hardships, then we can abort them, if that's the argument. But those same things could apply for an old person at some point. And so where do you go from there? So if now I'm old, I'm causing economic hardship, I'm old, my, emotional or, my mental faculties are diminished. So what makes me different then, logically, what the argument is made, what makes me different from the baby in the womb? I am not a productive person who's able to think, function on
Yeah.
my own. I'm a drain on society financially and otherwise. So what would be the difference in saying, well, let's kill the 6-month baby in the womb and let's kill the 90-year-old man?
Right. Right.
The arguments are identical.
Yeah.
And so if
Just
you open up that
location
door-
and developmental level.
That's
Those are the
it.
only differences. Yeah.
Tax history or something like that.
Right, yeah.
Other than that, there is no difference in terms
Yeah.
of what the person, the condition that they're in.
Or even not even an old person. God forbid somebody gets in a horrific accident or something.
Absolutely.
And their brain level or their intelligence level is that of somebody with, some disorder or syndrome.
It could be a complete vegetable.
Right, exactly. And say, well, now's the, we can't, now he's dependent on other people. We can't, And I think that first one you mentioned, the socioeconomic, in my experience, that's kind of the biggest. And I was even looking at some statistics, and I think, and it was like 2004, they did surveys of women who had abortions, and that was the number one reason.
Wow.
Was socioeconomic. And one of my favorite verses to go to when we talk about abortion is Psalm 127:3 and following, where it says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate." So I think part of the thing is just how we as a culture view children. And they're a drain, and they're draining our resources. We can't afford them. They're difficult. And don't get me wrong, I think there's women who, single mothers who are teenagers who are thinking, how is this going to happen? But that baby is going to be loved and can be taken care of. And there are people who can help you. And the solution isn't to end that baby's life, Right. And I think that if we kind of had a more of a biblical view of children, right, as opposed to a worldly view, I think that would help. I think that would help us, generally speaking.
It's also kind of backward, because if you look at cultures, most cultures that are economically at the bottom end have more children than people who are at the very, very top end of economics. So if you say, well, it's going to be a hardship, well, those are people who are having all the kids. And
Right.
so if you were to look at it like that, it's just, well, you just don't want to have to deal with anything. It's not that having a kid creates this difficulty where you won't survive. People who are in lower economic brackets have children far more than people who are higher. And so it's not a thing where you can't do it.
Right.
There are resources out there. There are social programs out there. You can make things work.
Yeah.
And so that argument to me is just kind of a selfish, I just don't want to have to sacrifice. I want to be able to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even in America, families had a lot of children back in the day, 100 years ago or so.
For sure, yeah.
With farm
100
labor
years
and
ago,
stuff,
50,
50 years ago,
Yeah.
My grandpa was one of like 8, and they were the small family on their block, like that's it was just a different story back then.
Anyway, another argument is pregnancy resulting from incest or rape, and I hear a lot of conservative people, quote unquote conservative people. Sometimes I've been known to listen to some conservative radio talk shows, and some of those hosts will be against abortion except when it comes to rape and incest. But rape and incest does not make the child any less human or any less of a person than it would otherwise. And so, to me, the same arguments would refute that as well. Now, again, it's a terrible situation.
Right.
Oh, and actually, when I think about rape and incest, I don't really know that incest ought to be included in that. It should just be rape, because if it's whether it's a relative
Most
that rapes
incest
you,
probably is rape.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that much incest is consensual.
Right.
But anyway, but again, the means, the how of the pregnancy does not do away with the who is inside the womb. And I know it must be a tragic thing. I can never speak for that, but it must be a very tragic thing. But again, does that justify the taking of another life?
I remember Mike Elledge used to say, and I don't know if he invented this, but he's the first person I ever heard say it, scenario, person A rapes person B is now pregnant with person C. The solution, kill person C. Right? And I know people don't like the word kill in there, but that's what happens, So how does ending the life of person C in any way justified because of what person A did to person B, Yeah. And I know there was a I remember there was a big, I just saw the clip, you know, Joe Rogan's podcast is like the biggest podcast in the world. And he had a guy on there, I think who worked for the Babylon Bee, and they were talking about abortion, and Joe Rogan was disagreeing with him. You know, the guy was like pro-life, and Joe Rogan was like, no. And he used an example of his daughter being raped. And he's like, you can't force my daughter to have that baby. Like, you're not looking out for my daughter. You know, got really heated.
Yeah.
And my thing is like, okay, what about your grandchild though? Like, you're so focused on your daughter. Think about your grandchild. We're ending your grandchild's life. Nobody thinks about it in those terms. People just always think, oh, you're going to make my daughter have that baby. What about letting your grandchild live? Like, that's another way to phrase what we're arguing for, you know? And I was just looking at some statistics on the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and I think this is statistics from the Guttmacher Institute. But they said, as of 2024, 0.4% of all abortions were because of rape and incest.
0.4%.
Yeah, 0.4% were from rape and incest.
Less than half a percent.
Yeah, and 0.3% were risk to the woman's life. So, I mean,
0.7% are
combined are risk to a woman's life and rape and incest. And the rest is other physical concerns, 2.2%, 1.2% abnormality in the unborn baby, talking about the genetic screening. And then 95.9% is elective. So, I mean, if you think about that, I mean, the really majority by a long shot is elective abortions.
not even close.
Yeah.
This probably wouldn't even be a social issue if the elective. I mean, if you had like 1% of all the people in the country who were having abortion, it wouldn't even be on the radar for people to even have discussion. That wouldn't make it right or wrong, but it wouldn't even be on the radar, which is kind of a crazy thought that number, 95% of the millions of abortions that take place are just people just saying, nah, I'm good.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And the other thing I was just thinking about, you mentioned that I thought about that Joe Rogan interview before we got started.
Yeah.
Because he got like intense. Like, it was going to be like one of those things we're going to tip over the table.
Right.
Like, as I was watching, I could feel the tension.
Yeah.
And he was making this argument that most people will make in those situations. It's an emotional rationalization.
Right.
And you hear this argument of emotion. Are you going to tell me that this dirty raper and you're going to make your baby go to those doctor's appointments? And it's this. And I would never argue that there's going to be no emotional scarring.
Yeah.
There's going to be emotional scarring. But life has emotional scarring.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I've got some emotional scarring from my upbringing. It has nothing to do with rape or incest or any of those sorts of things. But the idea is you can't justify, like you use that simple analogy, A, B, and C. Killing the person C doesn't fix it. I do understand that it might make a person feel like, okay, you know, now we got something back, you know, or now I don't have to be reminded of that event that took place, you know, but it doesn't justify murder of a baby,
right?
No matter what you do. You know, I could say this person hit me with their car, let's murder them because of, you know, whatever, and that might make me feel good in the moment, but that doesn't justify taking the life of a person, no matter what's the scenario.
Yeah, that's a great point. I heard a quote one time where the person said, if a fetus is a living human being, then there's no justification for ending its life other than, you know, the mother's life being at stake. And then, but the flip side of that is, if it's not a living human being, then no justification is required. And that's kind of the tricky part, where people will say it's not a human being, but here are my reasons. Why do you need a reason? If it's like removing a tumor or like removing a, you know what I mean? Like, why do you even have, and now some women, some people out there don't even have reasons. They don't care, but.
That's why they started using clump of cells.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
Went from baby to fetus, and that was a little bit cleaner, and now clump of cells. Because now there's a complete humanistic disassociation where it's not, like you were saying, it's not even a person yet.
Right.
It's just this
clump of cells.
Yeah.
Dehumanizing.
Yeah.
You're a clump of cells. I'm a clump of cells.
Yeah.
Like, what are the cells? Like, what? That's are those human cells? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
But that just shows the futility of that argument. You know, you just can't get around it. And even if it were, I think I don't know if you mentioned this one earlier, Brother Brian, Psalm 139, verses 15 and 16, about being incomplete, basically. Yeah. You're still a person. You're still you, even though you're unfinished.
In the inward parts,
not fully developed in the embryonic state.
And as we were talking about the rape argument, it's like a lot of it falls back into that socioeconomic. Only maybe it's more of the shock, the unwanted, the unexpected pregnancy. What are going to do? The shock of it. And as Stephen had mentioned, is sometimes it's the shock of it, the emotional no way. But given what Forrest said, how about thinking of the grandchild part of that?
Right.
The grandchild part of that and the future life that could be the next Einstein or whoever.
Yeah.
All right. And then, of course, the viability argument, we kind of talked about that, but abortion is allowable as long as the unborn life is not yet viable. And that means able to live outside the womb or whatever, but humans take about 4 or 5 years before a kid is viable.
Right. No, I've heard that before. Itself. Like, the fetus is dependent upon the mother. The newborn's dependent upon the mother.
Absolutely.
So if that's an argument for being able to end its life, I mean, you could have post-birth abortions.
Mm-hmm. You can have, again, the 50-year-old abortion, the 25-year-old abortion for somebody who's, incapacitated.
All right, and so when we think about abortion, then let's look at some things about human life, the treatment of human life. What makes abortion sinful? Well, number one, of course, the value of human life, and as we were just talking about, if it's not human, then we don't need a reason.
Right.
And you think about, we can do all kinds of experiments on animals and things like that for medical research and all that. But because they're animals, we don't have to worry about, we don't mistreat animals, but for the sake of bettering humanity, I think it would fall under the category of, having dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air and so forth, that we can use that. We can do all kinds of artificial insemination on animals and that kind of thing without it being wrong. But when it comes to humans, it's a little bit different, because human life is made in the image and likeness of God, and so there's something special, something sanctified about human life.
And I think that's why you have to the pro-abortion advocates have to use that language, clump of cells, parasite, things like that, because if you actually call it what it is, what you're advocating for is unconscionable. Because we're talking about the ending of a human life in utero, right? This morning I walked out of my garage, and a roach ran, and I stomped on it and killed it. And I didn't feel bad about it at all.
No.
Right? Because that's not a human being, it's totally different. It's a totally different thing.
Whether or not you felt bad about it is irrelevant.
Right.
It's the fact that wasn't, because you could have fell on the ground and cried.
Right.
But that still doesn't make that roach a human.
Yeah.
And the fact that you were cavalier about it doesn't make it anything.
Right.
It's just,
that's
it is
point.
what it is.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty good observation there, because there would be people that would cry and say you did sin because you squashed the roach, because in their mind animals have the same standing. Animal life has the same standing of human life, and that's just not true. Not true.
Can I throw in this part too? Is that I would like to say that we are not saying that there is no scenario in which human life can or should be taken, because God has given license in certain areas. And so there would be some who would try to posit that we're saying, oh, so you're saying that you can't do anything. So, no, God has given license. And that also demonstrates the importance of life, because God had to give regulation. That it can't just be taken kind of willy-nilly, as you would say. Jinx can't talk for you. But, the fact that he had to say, hey, here's the only occasion that this can happen, and here's the method by which it's, even in the Old Testament, there's, like if you accidentally kill someone, you go to the city of refuge so it could be investigated. You couldn't just run in there and just murder the guy for doing something, because what if it was an accident? What if it wasn't really him? Yeah. So there was all these regulations to protect human life, which shows that God has always had life in mind to continue. But also that there are times in which a person licensed by God's authority can take a human life. But it's murder that's the sin that we're talking about, the unsanctioned or unauthorized taking of human life.
I knew a preacher that the church building was right next to an abortion clinic in another city in Florida. And this is before online and all that kind of stuff. But on the one side of the church marquee, the preacher put, intentionally taking innocent human life is murder. And then on the other side, he said abortion, or actually the first side said abortion is intentionally, or a murder is intentionally taking innocent human life. Then on the other side, it said abortion is intentionally taking innocent human life.
Right.
And he had a news media over there and everything, interviewing him and all that kind of stuff.
I'm sure.
And when I taught ethics here at Florida School of Preaching, when I went over murder and stuff, they had to have those two I words in that definition: intentionally taking innocent human life. Because there is some intentional taking of life that is authorized, capital
self-defense, capital punishment,
and then there is accidentally
right,
taking innocent human life, and so, but the intentional taking of innocent human life is murder, and that's exactly what goes on in abortion.
And I think that's the travesty where you have a large swath of people who are deluded into thinking that it's not a human life. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that really is kind of where the debate's at. But I think there's no way to escape that fact, unfortunately, for pro-abortion advocates. And I think that, another aspect of this is just, like you were saying, being made in the image and likeness of God. That's where it all comes down to, Right. And when God first gives the idea of the death penalty in Genesis 9, he does it based on the fact that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. So if you destroy that, you're destroying the image and likeness of God, and there's consequences for that. That's not moral. And I think that if you have to ask the question, another way to phrase it, because there are Christians who are, pro-abortion and things, right. Even pro-elective abortion. You are putting yourself in the position of deciding which human beings do and do not bear the image and likeness of God. And that, to me, is just like a place I don't want to be in, right? I feel like we have to say all human beings bear his image. And that's what makes them, regardless of their economic drain, regardless of how they can't impact society, regardless of how dependent they are on other people. You're a human being, you're made in the image of God, and therefore have some sanctity, innocent human being, and you can't take his life.
That's why many of the people who would say that they're both a Christian and pro-abortion, or pro-choice, I think it's called.
Yeah.
They buy into this Kool-Aid of the renaming it. So it's no longer a baby. And so now they start to use some of that same terminology. I know an individual who's a member of the church that put some things out on Facebook a while back about abortion, and I noticed the exact same language. Yeah. And they have to use that language because that's what gives them license to be able to say that this is okay. Right. Because if they say this is a human baby and it's okay to do it, well, now they're defeating their own, promotion of Christianity. Yeah. However, if they say, well, it's not yet a baby because it's not born and all these sorts of things, then they can give themselves a little bit more license. Right. Is they have to rob the scriptures away from what they say.
For sure. And I always think about, if we know that Jesus became a man, if Jesus was ever, or God became, God took on flesh, became a man in Jesus Christ. If you ever, in the incarnation, if you're at a stage of development that Jesus was at, you're a human being and you can't be killed. Like, I think that's like Jesus, all of us, we were never a sperm, we were never an egg, but all of us were the thing right after that, a zygote. Every single one of us, right? Even Jesus Christ, God incarnate, was a zygote at one point, So if we're at a level where Jesus was that, then you can't. It's off. You can't end its life.
Well, we're about out of time, but we have a lot left on the table. So we're going to have a part 2 of this episode on abortion, and so we look forward to seeing you then. We thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, please let us know. FSOP@fsop.net is our email. We look forward to seeing you the next time. Have a great rest of the day.
Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary, on Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his